The Early Church Fathers. I have already shown you that church leaders prior to the time of Clement of Alexandria and Origen the idiot had no real interest in interpreting the scriptures for themselves. That was because the leaders of the early church understood they were supposed to be handing down the things Jesus Christ had taught the apostles. In spite of their view that the mission of the church was to preserve intact and hand down the apostolic teaching, however, early church fathers were convinced that once true believers had been instructed in the truth, they could read and understand the scriptures just as one would read and understand any other book. In that, they held a position somewhat similar to that of Martin Luther and John Calvin. So we can say that with the exception of Luther and Calvin's misplaced confidence that God expected true believers to read and interpret the scriptures for themselves, the Reformers' view of how the scriptures should be understood is fairly close to what the early church believed. Since I have spent the better part of the past 7 years explaining the things I just mentioned, I won't bother presenting in this book the vast body of evidence that demonstrates their truthfulness. Anyone who is interested can read what I have already written. I have barely begun to demonstrate just how foreign the concept of interpreting Scripture was in the early church. By the time I have completed the task God has called me to, those who reject the logic of my position will have no excuse for not believing, other than the fact that they have arbitrarily chosen not to. Now let's take a look at what the early church fathers taught concerning Calvin's contention that the church is spiritual Israel. Those of you who had been reading my commentary on Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho in the Voice of Elijah update already know his view. John Calvin could have easily penned the comment Justin wrote less than 70 years after the last of the apostles died. For the true spiritual Israel and descendants of Judah, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham, who in uncircumcision was approved of and blessed by God on account of his faith, and called the father of many nations, are we who have been led to God through this crucified Christ. One has only to read with an open mind what Justin wrote about his conversation with the Jew Trypho to come to the decided opinion that the church is the continuation of Israel as far as he is concerned. But Justin was not a lone voice crying in the wilderness of the 2nd century. The early church fathers are in unanimous agreement that the church is in some sense Israel. They insist Christians are the recipients of the promise God made to the patriarchs. The author of the Epistle of Barnabas even gives a lengthy, although convoluted, explanation of how that came to be. Irenaeus, the most orthodox of all the early church fathers, and the one who defined the meaning of the term heresy, tells us clearly how he understands the church's relationship to Israel. Now I have shown a short time ago that the church is the seed of Abraham, and for this reason, that we may know that he who in the New Testament raises up from the stones children unto Abraham is he who will gather, according to the Old Testament, those that shall be saved from all the nations. Only a fool would dare deny that this pillar of the 2nd century church firmly believed the church was somehow the continuation of Israel, the Old Testament people of God. That is precisely the same point that Tertullian makes in his work titled An Answer to the Jews. Yet some might still choose to believe the scriptures teach that the church has no essential connection with Israel at all. Therefore, let me remind you the Apostle Paul plainly tells us the Jews have been cut off from the tree that symbolically represents Israel, and Christians have been grafted in to that same tree. Romans 11:17 through 24. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches, but if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right, they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, But fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Behold then, the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more shall these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? I realize Satan has gone to great lengths to gain widespread acceptance for his own perverted interpretation of this passage. It's an integral part of his deception. That's why my very first publication was the book Not All Israel is Israel. I suggest you read that book extremely carefully, then reread it again and again until you fully understand the essential points I made there. It is the foundation on which I am going to build the message God called me to deliver to all those who seek to know the truth in this generation. So if you can't understand the message of that book, or if you don't agree with it, I advise you to look elsewhere for whatever it is you seek. But should you choose to reject the central truth I presented in Not All Israel is Israel, I warn you, it is something Satan does not want you to believe. Understand me clearly. Everything I teach is based on the fact that Jesus Christ is the Israel spoken of by the prophets. As I explained in Not All Israel is Israel, every Jew, except Jesus Christ, had been cut off from Israel by the time Israel, Jesus Christ, accepted the terms of the new covenant when he was baptized by John the Baptist. There is, therefore, now no Israel other than Jesus Christ as far as God is concerned. That is why Paul says Christians, as members of the body of Jesus Christ, have become joint heirs with Christ of the promise that God made to the patriarchs. The early church fathers understood full well that unregenerate Jews are no longer a part of Israel. They knew the Jews had been cut off from Israel and Gentiles were being grafted in. Yet idiots still try to refute what Paul wrote to true believers at Rome. Romans 2:28 through 29. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, neither is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God. If you want to state the case in the same way that John Calvin and Justin Martyr did, the church is spiritual Israel. However, it would be best if you didn't do that. Use the parabolic imagery of the scriptures that the apostles and prophets used and let it go at that. The church, as the body of Jesus Christ, is Israel. The designation spiritual Israel implies there is a literal Israel other than the church, the body of Jesus Christ, when in fact there isn't. It is true that, parabolically speaking, true believers are members of the spiritual body of Jesus Christ. So in that sense, the church is spiritual Israel. In every other sense, however, true believers are, collectively, literal Israel because the spiritual body of Jesus Christ is literal Israel. So you can see it was only the Reformers' fuzzy thinking in regard to the Jews and the millennium that left the door open for Satan to entice some fool into crafting the goofy notion that the Jews are literal Israel. Satan picked his man 170 years ago, and he has been busy ever since making sure his lie is seen as the gospel truth by as many true believers as possible. That's why I'm going to tell you what Satan's lie is, and then explain how he intends to use it to shepherd billions of people into his deception when he appears as the Antichrist. That way, if you choose not to believe me, you will be responsible for your own destruction.